Okay. Should introduce a little bit of the background here. The Cyber Civilization Research Center is part of KGI at Keio University, co-directed by Jun Murai and myself. And what we're trying to do is bring a set of topics that would be of interest to the evolution of cyber civilization, both from technology standpoint and the public standpoint. And issues like the one for today is going to be looking at the governance, both administrative and technical governance of the internet. The internet started out, as many of you know, as a largely US-centric process and has obviously grown to be international with nation states and people deeply involved, deeply worried about the way it's run. Nation states have opinions, and we wanted to explore some of those and explore some of the mechanisms that have been proposed for managing. I tend to like the word managing the internet, but the term that's often used is governing the internet. And so we gathered here with two other people. Bob Hinden has a long experience in the internet, both technically and as part of the Internet Society Governing Board and the IETF and many other things. So there's a deep historic knowledge there and current knowledge. And then Jun Murai, who I assume all of you know. Jun is the father of the Japanese internet. I couldn't resist putting that in. And so I'd like to start with a very simple question. I'm going to be an active moderator. It's almost impossible for me to just sort of sit back and say nothing, so I probably reserve the right. And we should have it free and clear. If anybody disagrees with somebody, cut in. It's perfectly reasonable. I attended a meeting recently whose title was basically the governance of the internet, the World Internet Forum. And there seemed to be a semi-large number of people who talked about governance of the internet. And so the first question I'll ask is, what do we mean by governance of the internet?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. Because Dave, I put some notes together when Dave first invited me to this. And I'm also very pleased to be here. I always like coming to Japan and talking to Jun and Dave. It's a wonderful honor. I was thinking about it. In some sense, the word internet governance is an oxymoron. Those two things don't really go together. The internet is it's a bunch of separate pieces that people join out of self-interest, but there's never been a regulatory structure. There's never been governance, so to speak. It's just people do it because it's useful to them and it works. I've been very involved in the IETF. They're all voluntary standards. You have to do those protocols if you want to be part of the internet, but they're not like the ITU standards, which countries are sort of more legal standards that you're supposed to follow, and you don't have any option if your country has signed it, I guess. So it's always been sort of a question, but there are clearly lots of issues that might be better if there were some common ways of doing things. So maybe that's what it needs to be. It's sort of like what we do for IETF protocol standards. If you're going to do this, do it this way. You're allowed to do other things, but if you want to interoperate with other people, then here's some good practices for doing it. But I don't think it's going to be a set of regulations that you have to follow, and there's someone then who's going to enforce it. We always, at the IETF, we always joke about, well, we need to call the internet protocol police because someone's not doing it right. Well, that clearly doesn't exist, nor I think is it very likely.
Okay, yeah. it's a kind of historical start of, when we started to use the internet governance. And but still, I think it's a really important point is that, when the internet was developed and then being operated by the internet operators or the internet community, but without the kind of consideration explicitly about the boundary of the nations. Okay, so because it was a purely technical approaches, and then as a result, then the internet being probably the almost a single space of a cyberspace which is truly global, and that's probably human being never been achieved in the past, right? So it's really the environment and the place and the space to communicate and the working together and the other thing as a single global entity. So when we started the internet governance discussion with first from IETF to the organization like a WIPO, right, for the intellectual property thing. And then that was we discussed a long time. I was involved on that discussion. And then the first interesting findings between those two was that, difference between the international space versus global space, right? Okay, so for the intellectual property discussion was one of the very good ones because intellectual property was registered in the nation by nation, and then it's truly the international collaboration and the work for anything, governance related to the intellectual property with the international basis. And but on the other hand, then the internet is, from the first point, it's a kind of global space. Therefore, the operation and the other things, development of the new protocols and other new technology, that was based on a truly global one. So today, the cyber civilization concept is truly the kind of, we are living on a mixture of them. And therefore, it's easy to confuse that those two, we are now seeing that those two, different nature of spaces, and then we are living on kind of both spaces. So that's what we are. So that's interesting that it's not international governance, but it should be the internet governance, which is very strongly tied up with the global governance thing, which is very difficult to achieve, but therefore we need to discuss with many stakeholders.
If I look back historically on quote, how did governance start? I'll use the term without definition. Fundamentally, it started when a bunch of people who were building it making decisions. And we decided, in fact, back in the early days of CSNet, that we wanted to internationalize it. So we quietly whispered to people who controlled the funding, is it okay with you? Sure, what the heck? And we distributed it. Okay, things have changed, and they changed dramatically once it became commercialized. Once companies got involved, there were a whole set of other structures on top of it that constantly come in. But I think the people keep thinking that they can adapt the traditional telecommunication governance to the internet. And so you have people like the ITU, and it's a part of the United Nations, believing that since they traditionally govern intercommunication of the telephone system, they might as well do that. And that type of looking for business, if I could use that term nastily, I think is part of the confusion, part of it. The Busan conference was co-sponsored by the UN and ITU and the World Economic Forum. Okay? But there are other organizations in the act, including industrial players who have a stake in it. Bob, you were on the Internet Society board. In fact, you were the chairman, partially when I was there. What was your reaction to the international politics of the governance and terms like stakeholders? And what do people mean by that?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. I mean, I was thinking, it seems like people see that there's a vacuum and some organizations or people want to fill it. And it's not so clear to me that it's a problem that needs, that we need to fill this vacuum, that this current system isn't working. Because I also think that the structure of the internet, I mean, ranges from we have users on one side and sort of ISPs and circuits on another side, but then there's a whole bunch of stuff in the middle, and then we're seeing, call it social media, but we're seeing large content companies provide services around the world, and they sort of follow the rules of countries they do business in, but it's challenged if each country or each region has a different set of rules. And they're clearly acting out of their own self-interest, which is usually to make money. I mean, one of them said they didn't want to do evil, but that's yet to be determined, or who decides what's evil or good. And I will admit that, I mean, when I started doing this, at BBN on the end of the ARPANET at the beginning, I mean, I think we really thought we were changing the world for the good, that allowing people to communicate without being censored or unfettered was a really good thing for the world. And for a while, it really seemed like it was happening. But it's certainly gotten a lot more challenging with, a mixture of bad actors, and, the internet has really enabled people to form groups, even if they're not, even if they're separated by geography. But that's allowed, that's if you have a hobby, it's really great. You can work with other people anywhere else who have the same hobby. But people have also discovered who have hobbies that we tend to frown on, or, are illegal things or criminal things. It allows them to organize very well too. And so I don't think we anticipate, at least I didn't anticipate, that we were going to get that. In hindsight, I guess I and everyone else was sort of naive. But, people, once they discovered that they could do what they like doing, but they couldn't do it at the same scale. The internet made it really easy to do it at the same scale. So I certainly think we have big problems to solve. And because the ways that I think many people view to control it also have the downside of controlling legitimate free expression and communication and talking to each other, and we see that in certain countries have different rules for that. And then also certain countries are bad actors against other countries, so it's gotten really messy.
But the stakeholder question they raised is also very important point, that when the multi-stakeholder, that phrase actually actively being used when the ICANN started, right? And then when the startup of ICANN, then it's a very interesting thing that that time, I mean, stakeholders that time has been discussed very kind of deeply. So of course, ISP, the address allocation to where, the RIR type of thing. So this is basically different from a telephone company you talked about. Telephone numbers are allocated based on the nation state, and then the business therefore would be a kind of control and by the nation state border. So this is truly the international model for the telephone is, but the IP address is not. So that is a stakeholder is a kind of allocation of the resources, and also operation, and then of course a government would be involved. Therefore, government might be one of the stakeholder or advisory board. That's it. How the ICANN started for the various reasons. It's interesting that even the government is going to be kind of one of the observer stakeholders, right? And then other. So that was the original model of how the internet governance started, other ICANN model, right? But the interesting thing today is that now who's going to be a stakeholders of the internet space? I mean cyberspace. Then it's a kind of very much kind of wider area, wider participants, and different type of the stakeholders of the cyberspace and the internet now. Therefore, probably it's interesting to keep discussing about who are the stakeholders in terms of internet governance decision making on the internet space, and then I think it's a little bit different from the original model of the ICANN when we started ICANN than today, because it's everybody and everywhere and everything's are connected to the internet.
Also, ICANN, when it started, its job was to allocate space, numbers, right, names and numbers. Very limited role. It was doing a job which was done by basically John Postel and a secretary. And but the financial model, at least my perception of it, the financial model brought in a lot of money, and so I'll use the term bureaucracy. It's just the people involved in it grew, and I forget what the ICANN budget is now, 300, something in the range of 300 million.
A big number.
It's a big number, right? And that tends to give you mission creep. And given you have money, given you have a lot of people, it's Peter's principle. For those who don't know Peter's, when you become a manager, you want people to manage. And so organizations tend to grow because every level of management wants a bigger set of people they can manage, recursively down. So you had that player with a lot of resources in the act. You have the political players, which I consider ITU to be a organization, quite competent organization, which had a function, a very important function in the early days, of controlling spectrum and controlling telephone numbers, basically, country codes, et cetera, and rules, account settling, et cetera. And again, when you build a large organization, you tend to want to keep it. There's nothing wrong with that. Companies do not say, our job is done, we'll exit stage left. They usually, in fact, try to build another business while they have the resources. And so there are just a lot of players in the act and competing against each other. Is that your perception?
Yes, I would agree with that. And, I was thinking about the ITU. I mean, a lot of the problems we face on the internet also are faced in the telephone system. And I don't see any solutions coming from, they haven't solved the same problems of fraudulent calls or people getting billed too much, or, now it's now trivial to spoof caller ID. So, you get, there's a thing, I don't know if it happens here, the thing in the US is you get calls that people say it's, some part of the US government and you owe them money and they're going to come arrest you and they want you to give them money, and the government would never call you like that, but, they scare people. And they're using the telephone system to do that because it's not their real number who's calling, and it make it this show as calling from the Internal Revenue Service, the tax organization. And so to me, at least, it doesn't seem like the ITU actually has any ability to, they don't have any experience in solving the same kind of problems on the internet where I think it's actually much harder than they did in the telephone system. So their ability to actually do, solve the important problems, I think, is very limited. Organizationally, they would like to do it. There are clearly countries who would prefer a government-oriented organization system like the ITU represents. but I think you tend to see, there sort of seems to me that there's sort of two forces on the internet. One is for, a more open, people are allowed to communicate with each other. There's very little content control or censorship, versus ones where there's strong barriers and you sort of need permission to do things. And certain content is, made, it's a violation of law to have. It's not a completely black or white thing, because, in the more Western model, there's clearly criminal activity, or I guess people like to talk about child porn. That people don't like that kind of content, but free speech is, allow people to say whatever they want, even if it's critical of the government. Where in other places, they don't want to allow that kind of speech. Commerce may be fine, but don't ever criticize the government. So I think those are some of the forces, and you see alignment of countries towards the ITU who I think want to have more control than other countries who want to have a more open model.
Well, actually, we've been, kind of already, kind of talking about, the original, kind of difference between the international versus global. I mean, the internet versus international. The internet certainly was not started to be other part of the, the government entity. So that's a big difference. ITU is certainly a UN-based entity, therefore the country by country, and then as I said, there are both responsibilities, the unwanted contents. Like what Bob said was that it's sometimes the child pornography. It's kind of consensus around the world. So the both space, the internet space and the government space can work together, and there is a consistency for that. But the free speeches or that kind of other things, and the operation itself, address allocation or resource allocation type of things, sometimes done independent from the nation's will, and but for the more toward the engineering and operational, the purposes. So, which is also right things to do in order to keep the internet running, right? So, internet governance should think about both. Both areas, the healthier and the smooth operation of the internet itself, digital data communicating and sharing around the world. And that's the basics of the internet. And also, we hear a lot of requirements from the state nations, different one, and also the business space, which is sometimes beyond the border of nations. And those are the kind of current model of the stakeholders. And then, so that's a little bit complicated one, but it's not that, I always see the kind of, optimistic way that, it's very important that discuss among the different opinions, different ideas, including those differences, but that's multiple stakeholders. And so that's for the internet governance, I think.
And one other, so when we talk about stakeholders, it's very easy for the people who have, companies or full-time jobs doing this, basically they get paid for it, to have a voice. They can go to the meetings, it's all of that. But then there's the actual users of the internet, and they have very little representation of what's best for them, and that their role is not just to allow other people to make money from them. It's sort of the thing I've heard talk about Facebook and Google a lot is like, it's free, but you're really the product, so you're selling something about yourself, even though you're not, you don't get money for it. But, And that's, I think, one of the challenges that we have, that we need to understand, learn what, or figure out what the right model is for how the users who actually use the internet, all the individuals and companies, and what their role in who represents them, how is, who's this, how do you represent that stakeholder? Because it's really important. Without the users, then we wouldn't be doing any of this.
Wasn't that the initial purpose of the Internet Society?
I think it was. Well, at least it was to bring everyone onto the internet. But I wonder if ISOC thinks their job is to represent the users. That's a slightly different thing.
Different.
Maybe they should.
Actually, yeah, I remember when we started the first kind of ISOC establishment discussion with the Larry Finn and those people. One of the requirements from the kind of you mentioned about U.S.-centric thing, right? It's the first point of the discussion, but I have some idea on that. But anyway, so it's not U.S.-centric, by the way. It's a U.S. had a kind of voice and idea that how the internet should be type of a thing, because they, of course, started that, but they understood, and then I'm not the U.S. citizen and the U.S. centric, of course, but I was kind of a student that how the internet should be properly operated and the developed type of a thing. But it was consistent with that time U.S. people were big number, but it's not a democracy we are talking about, but kind of idea and the vision and the philosophy. So it's not a centric type of a thing, right? And U.S. generated the good ideas to be shared by everybody. So that's a U.S.-centric part. But then getting back to the idea that we are ISOC origin. I was sitting in the different island called Japan, and then we are running the computer network, and then the people like David Farber visited us, and then so let's get connected. So including the ARPANET and the other things, and the CSNet, and then existing we call the JUNet, but computer networks together so inter connection among all those existing computer networks. And then which protocol we will use, and the TCP/IP, and that time when the ISOC was established, that not very much about the kind of protocol decision yet, right? But then the interconnection for the emails and other things were very important. And then it was international, beyond the country connection was so difficult. I mean, in a country like Japan, and because it's international relations should be done, usually have been with the government, right? So now the computer networks were mostly operated by the people like us, I mean, researchers and the other thing. And then they had a kind of a leadership to work together. So that was the first, kind of ISOC community's original before ISOC. Then we worked together, and then so I remember that I was asking that those active people who been working on CSNet internet people that we really need that our activity and about the interconnection of the computer network should be visible and understandable and kind of in the more wider way. Therefore, there should be some kind of umbrella organization or the leadership around the world sitting together and then identifying that this computer network interconnection is going to be a kind of not authorized, but I can say authorized by somewhere else, and we need some part. Then if the Japan-like country coming after Japan, then it's going to be very easy. I remember talking to that kind of points, and then when the ISOC was established, then I remember that Larry or Bin came to me and is that is that matching your requirement? At least I was asked by that question, so I said yes.
Let me change the subject for a moment. I think what we have now is, through many organizations, a sort of undefined term. Or at least we don't really understand how to govern whatever it means. There are many, many players in the act. What should it look like? And any brilliant ideas? I mean, it's pretty clear to me that right now we have a contest between different players, all fairly wealthy players, to govern by their standards. And on one hand, you have people who believe that people have the right to communicate. I mean, essentially, under some interpretations of the UN Charter, they have the right to freely communicate. There are other players who think, yes, you have the right to communicate with our services. And others that say, no, you do not have the right to do anything. You have a restricted set of rights. And so we do need something a vehicle to both discuss and at some point in the game to come up with a set of understandings of how the rules are to be established. I mean, otherwise, I think there's a danger that we'll see what's beginning to happen now, where certain parts of the world reserve the right to disconnect, not just meter, but disconnect. And that's in the long term not going to be potentially a healthy product, a healthy situation. But where do we go from here? And let me split that into two parts. Okay, one is the IETF as an organization still the right vehicle for handling the technical aspects of internet management? I'm going to use management rather than governance there, because we're trying to manage a technology which is changing dramatically. Every time we get new communication systems, things will change. At some point in the distant future, hopefully, we'll get things like quantum networks. I think it's probably not reasonable to believe that that's not going to change the underlying technology that we use. I mean, IP is not necessarily forever. Yeah? And so as we go into that era where we have to change things, is the IETF still a good vehicle? Or do we need something else? And for the governance part of the Act, making sure that the internet can come up with a civilized set of rules for interconnect, which the telephone industry did a fairly good job on. And you picked up the telephone with exceptions. You could call any place in the world and talk. You might have people listening, but you could talk, right? And I think we would like that to continue. We'd like to have the freedom to intercommunicate, and maybe with a set of rules, but where do those rules develop? Any ideas?
So let me try the IETF part of this first. I've continued to be active. The IETF, I'm going to the Singapore meeting on Friday. So I think the IETF is generally still pretty good at this. I mean, it's not different than when I first started doing it. But, it has a set of procedures and processes that I think are open. They allow anyone to show up and participate. It's not, at least in theory, no one has more say than anyone else. It's real people, so it's a little different than that. But generally, I think it works pretty well. It's only as good as the people who actually show up in the meetings, or do, or write documents, or, the problems they solve. And it's not the only, it doesn't do the web protocols. It doesn't do the, lower layer network protocols like IEEE does, or, the web W3C, probably a few other examples. But for the internet protocols and the management of them and the routing and the, and a lot of security now, especially the web security and the new developments around QUIC, I think it's working pretty well. And, I think it's still viable. It's evolving like all, it's like you either evolve or die. And so I think it's doing that. I can't say I personally agree with everything changes made, but I think that's fine. I don't have to. But I'm still interested enough that I want to participate in it. And, I even write technical documents these days. So, and I actually wrote a little code to, Wireshark implementation. So I'd like to stay involved. So I think the ITF can still do its role. And the other thing I'll just say about, in some world models, there's the notion that there's the technical part and then there's the policy part. Well, I don't think it's that clear, personally. I think that a lot of technical decisions are effectively policy decisions because they limit what the policy choices are. And, I think that's something that some people in the ITF understand. I'm not sure people outside understand, but I think it's what gets standardized in the actual protocols that people implement. You can only do what those protocols will do or not do. Those are the only levels of control you have. So, the choices it makes, like even the basic choice of using packet switching versus circuit switching years ago was a pretty big policy change. I mean, it changed how the whole industry, changed from a circuit switch telephone network to a packet switch. Now everything is packet switched. And that was they didn't announce it as a policy decision. They just thought it was a better technical way of solving the problem of moving data around, a more efficient way. I think that was right. And there's clearly going to be something after that too. I don't know what it is, but things evolve. So yeah, so I think to your question, I think the ITF is still a viable technical forum, as the internet grows and evolves going forward.
Well, actually, we have to be very careful in the, packet switching, circuit switching to a packet switching, and then how the packet switching as a kind of IP-based one, is going to be evolved and developed. That was, I think ITF is a great place to work on that space. But Bob, you separated the policy and the technology. But I think that was a policy for the technology, right? I mean, things like circuit switching to a packet switching is a policy for technology. And there is another thing. I believe that David's first question about the rules and then segmentation of the communication and that kind of thing is a policy of the use of the internet technology. So when the technology is developed, and then people started to use the technology. So the policy of the technology is how the technology should be, contributing to the people and the use, and the commonly, and hopefully globally. So that's a policy for the technology development. And the policy of the use is that, I don't want my kids to use this for these purposes. So, thinking about the abusers, and then, so what is abuse, or what is the proper use? What is a more ethical use? Or, that kind of discussion is a policy of use. So this should not be confused, I believe.
Right. I mean, at some level, the technology doesn't care whether it's good content or bad content or stuff. I mean,
right.
That's probably purposeful. But yeah, so I certainly agree with that. I was just trying to make the point that technical decisions do have policy impacts. They're not, policy and technology are not completely separate.
Right.
I'm not current in this, but it seems to me several years ago when I was more current with the politics. There was a question of one nation state wanting a separate encryption system than another one. That gave the opportunity in principle to get complete isolation, right? From a techno-policy perspective, is that an appropriate thing to do or a non-appropriate thing to do?
What is the encryption system
Well,
to be
enable
controlled?
it. To enable it.
Encryption system to be controlled by a single
To have
nation.
alternate encryption systems so you could decide that,
The mic.
yeah, back and forth. Remember that one?
Yeah, it's, I mean, I
That's
just,
where policy and technology sort of bumped very hard against each other. From a technical standpoint, it gave a mechanism for isolation.
Right.
From a policy standpoint, there were people who wanted that isolation.
right. I mean, back to the ITF a bit. And so the ITF has sort of adopted, I'm afraid to use the word policy, but it's certainly the consensus of the ITF that encryption is good and that the more things that are encrypted is a good thing, and they're actively doing that in protocols.
Right.
And both, I mean, the effort developing that the ITF is doing around QUIC is quite interesting because it's breaking some of the layering models, but the result is both faster and more secure.
Can you just give a 2-second? The audience, people who are going to watch this don't know what QUIC is.
So QUIC is, I don't even know what the acronym stands for.
Forget about the
But it's basically, I mean, there's been, it's evolving the web protocol, the HTTP, the transport protocol for web stuff, and what we used to call TLS, and sort of bringing those together to make them faster. It takes the fact that you have a secure channel, you don't need to create new connections as much, and the results are, I think, quite good, and we're seeing them deployed in lots of popular browsers these days. But and this is getting all standardized in the ITF, and I think it's a very nice evolution of what came out of the web, and WCC with TLS and the ITF's HTTP sort of brings a lot of it together, and high quality encryption. So I think it's that's the kind of stuff the ITF is doing, and I guess we're seeing a lot of controversy about secure DNS now, or DNS over HTTP, or all of that too. So I think the notion that making it harder to look at your traffic except at the endpoints is sort of what people in the ITF likes to do.
Well, many governments, not just particular ones,
Yes.
do not like that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a kind of a long-term discussion about encryption to be controlled by which entity type of thing, right? And so what Bob said was like more toward the end-to-end encryption concept, and then when the end-to-end encryption achieved successfully, then it's very difficult to intercept and understanding what the communication would be. So if there is some other entity who wants to kind of intercept the communication and make sure that this communication is the right thing or wrong, so this still, I think, it's a policy of use of the communication, and that then whereas technology development is a policy of technology development with a kind of certain policy, which is end-to-end communication, is a technology policy, that the implementation about design of the technology. So that sometimes as you mentioned, then it's a conflict and that there is a discussion, but then so I think it's not that difficult to identify who wants what type of things. Then so what is the next step for each of the entities? So that's probably what we should do.
But it's also, I mean, encryption is interesting too, because it's like, even in the US, which is generally pretty open and doesn't look at content too much, I mean, certain parts of the US government think that they don't like the idea of end-to-end encryption, and they think they should be able to, you know, perhaps with a warrant, perhaps not, should be able to look inside those packets. And, you know, you see leaders of the FBI and so forth giving speeches about, you know, how this is bad for them. And where, I mean, we could probably talk a lot about, you know, the amount of, the internet has made law enforcement's job harder in some respects, but in other respects, it's made it so much easier because there's so much metadata around. It's very easy to see who's talking to each other, even though you may not be able to know what they're saying. And so there's like, and then there are records of this. And so it's both, they have some things that are harder, but then there's other stuff that they just gives them access to things they couldn't possibly ever do before. So it's, you know, it's hard to have the right kind of conversation about those policies.
Very difficult. There's another area where similar problems arise, a couple areas. The network is not the only place where encryption comes in. You know, cell phones, many cell phones have very difficult to break encryption because they're in the hardware. And if they're done right, very difficult to penetrate. People like that. Law enforcement in general doesn't like it, and that's fairly universal. Another one, which I think is, again, the type of governance that we're going to have to deal with at some point, is the whole cyber criminal problem. There's, you know, we're in a world now where there's no agreements. There are country by country agreements sometimes, but in a world where, you know, nobody knows your dog, that old cartoon, some countries cannot prosecute cyber crimes, so they're havens for that. And that type of governance, I think, is something that we're going to have to evolve, but I'm not sure how. And you know, ideas there, I think, would be very welcome for both us and anybody listening to this, because there's serious problems. And cyber civilization, term civilization, carries a lot of baggage with it, including quite often laws that govern behavior. And you can have regressive laws and progressive laws. And I think we're in that battle right now. Yeah, okay. What do you think of, we now have at least, why don't we, before I start on that, let's take a brief break. It's a nice opportunity. Okay?
Good.